When did one crazy chance stop you from ruining your life? Had a friend who asked if I wanted to move to California with him and his family. I was 16 and thought it sounded fun. I didn't know at the time, but he was actually rescuing me from my insane mother and a not-so-happy home life. When you have stuff like this going on, sometimes it's hard to know that it's happening until you become an adult and gain a perspective. I shudder to think what would have happened to me if I'd stayed there. In 1996, my parents were deciding between two houses to move into. They picked the new construction that resulted in being placed on shoddy soil and years of lawsuits when we ultimately moved in 2001. Anyway, the other house they could have picked, presumably on better soil, would have placed my older sister at a well-known high school beginning with C in the exact same year as an infamous massacre that took place there. 2 consecutive seizures from alcohol withdrawal the day I checked into rehab without detoxing. I was told afterwards that it was 50-50 that I survived that night. I'm currently just a couple of months shy of 5 years sober. I broke my lease and moved out of a terrible apartment complex I was living in to move back home because I was broke. 2 weeks later, the whole complex burned to the ground from a crystal lab in another unit. A few clarifications. The apartment was right outside of downtown Birmingham, Alabama. I didn't have renter's insurance, I was a broke 20-year-old at the time, so I wouldn't have got any kickback from it. I did end up getting my security deposit back, which they said I had forfeit by breaking the lease, so that was nice. And you sillies, that crystal lab wasn't mine. I picked mine up and brought mine to Florida with me where it belonged. Good. Can't have Alabama taking credit for Florida Crystal. I also choose to believe that the man who wrote this was just fleeing further away from Walter White and his competition. When I was a teen, I was very sick. I was like 90 pounds and couldn't hold down food. I knew something was wrong with me, but doctors were falsely under the impression that I had an eating disorder, and thought I was lying and that my parents were enabling me. At one hospital visit when I was 17 years old, I was lied to by a doctor and tricked into joining an eating disorder program against my will. They kept telling me that they were going to keep me in the hospital for 3 to 6 months, and they had this whole program planned out for me, and they put me on an insanely high dosage of anxiety meds that turned me into a zombie person. They weren't telling my parents much info, and my mum actually caught them having secret conversations about me that they didn't want her to hear. We were starting to get vibes that they might forcibly take me away from my parents. So I made up an excuse to leave the hospital and said I'd be back in a couple of days, but never did go back. I waited a very hard year alone with no treatment until I turned 18, when I was legally an adult and couldn't be kidnapped, and then I felt safe enough to try to give medical treatment another go. I finally found out that I had lupus the whole time. It freaks me out to think what would have happened to me if I'd been forced into eating disorder treatments for years for no reason and getting zero treatment for the pretty dangerous disease they were so sure I didn't have. Everyone had good intentions and doctors save so many lives. They're often really, really, really good people, but I hate that people like me slip through the cracks and almost die sometimes. For those wondering, I didn't take any legal action. It honestly didn't occur to me because I'd been going to too many different doctors for 5 years at that point, and I always had the same experience, like not being believed, them trying to force treatment for an eating disorder or mental illness, and that last hospital visit was just the terrible climax to my story. I didn't know any different because to me that was just how the medical system was. In retrospect, I wish I'd done something, though. I hope the system improves and this stops happening. Much love to those with similar hard stories, and also nurses and doctors who are compassionate. I was supposed to hang out with a couple of friends one night. We were going to go to a party that we were all invited to the weekend before. I asked to get off work early so I could go to the party. My manager let me go, so I went to find my friends. But I had a really, really bad feeling all day, and it just kept getting worse. Instead of turning left to go to my friend's house, I turned right and went home. I found out a few weeks later that they got busted with white snow in their car. They were 16 and 17 at the time, I was 18, so I would have been screwed. The biggest of life's bullets that I dodged was a 9mm. Christmas 2008. Me and my little bro were opening gifts in the living room and a bullet came through our crappy roof, landing a few centimeters away from where we were. Once at a bar, a woman was surprisingly into me as we danced. If I'd had more confidence back then, I definitely could have taken her home. In the end, one of my karaoke buddies ended up with her instead and got caught by her husband that night. I know a guy that got stabbed by the husband after he went home with a woman. Apparently she just liked seeing the husband go crazy on the dudes she brought home. I was on the train in Brooklyn a few years ago. Next to me was this man who had a big house tool in his book bag. I think it was a hammer. I was shoulder to freaking shoulder next to this guy and I knew something was up. He was moving very oddly. It was just the vibe that this man is up to something. I decided that once we got to the next stop, I'd get off the train and catch the next one, which I did. 30 minutes later, this guy gets off the train at my stop and starts attacking people. He went after cops and was shot. If I didn't get off that train and instead got off with him, I might be dead. In 1996, the IRA bombed the Arndale Centre in Manchester. Myself and a group of friends were on a bus heading straight there. We were probably about 10 to 20 minutes out. The thing is, one of my friends was late, so we had to get on the bus just after the one we intended to get on. Guess where that bus was when the aforementioned bomb went off? I almost fell for a pyramid scheme in high school. My friend brought me to one of their meetings, ACN, and I was so on board, but my parents talked me down. I was upset at them until I learned more about multi-level marketing schemes and quickly changed my mind. Sometimes I imagine where I'd be now if I went through with it. It wouldn't be pretty, that's for sure. High school girlfriend wanted to talk about baby names. I was headed to college. No thoughts of being a parent. My mum even found a note in my pocket listing her favorites if we had a boy. Anyway, we broke up after 2 years. The next guy she dated was a dad within 9.5 months. Yeah, it sounds like you definitely dodged a couple of bullets there. The first being a family you weren't necessarily interested in having, and the second one being the one you were held up with when you were working in the gas station for the rest of your life, trying to support said family. Not me, but my dad. He travelled to London for work back from 2001 to 2007. He was booked for the day off on July 7th, 2005, as that's my birthday, and the train he normally got to work was one of the ones that was attacked. Met a guy years ago, thought we were friends, got into contact with him a few years ago, and he was acting sketchy, so I unfriended him. I looked him up and found out he was on an offenders registry. I was at the Tacoma Mall when the Tacoma Mall shooting happened, walking right towards where the guy opened fire when my then fiancé decided to go back into a store we were just in. No crap, the time it took us to get back to the store was the same amount of time it would have taken to be right where it all broke out. 10 seconds one direction or 10 seconds the other, hearing the screams and shots echoing in the mall was crazy. They locked us in the Suncoast video store for a while before having us exit out the back. To add some more detail, since people are asking, I'd run into a person I worked with at the time about 10 minutes before the shooting. I think he went back to Macy's and we went to the Suncoast. We were Christmas shopping, the mall was pretty busy. It came down to my fiancée remembering she just wanted to get someone a series of Friends DVDs. So we headed back. Just as we were a few feet from the store, the first cluster of shots rang off, and there was this shared confusion as to what the frick was happening. My first thought was gang violence or something. It was Tacoma after all, because it sounded like several people blasting off at once. There were echoes. If something like this happened today, I'd probably more correctly guess what it was, but then it wasn't so much of a thing as it is now. We had to yell at several women who were still looking around right outside the store, confused. We told them to shelter inside, waving at them. My memory might be off, but it felt like maybe 20 or 30 of us crammed into the Suncoast, them having put the metal gate down and locking it. So we were all in there just listening to the shots and screaming, wondering what was happening. As time went on and it continued, it seemed less likely to be some gang thing, as they'd get the frick out. So I and others started saying we needed to exit the store. He could have shot through the metal gate, and we'd be fish in a barrel. I was spared from seeing anyone who was shot. The co-worker I'd just seen prior was not so lucky, as he was around several who'd been hit. It understandably really affected him. He was this tough truck driver dude who doesn't take crap from anyone, and when I saw him and we talked about it, he started crying. Crazy how much pain one person is capable of inflicting. I think about this day a lot. Being spiritual and not religious, I feel like God spared us that day. I'm sorry to hear about others who were adversely affected by it. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out Easy Mode, also linked below, and subscribe. Not me, but my dad. COVID saved his life. He was having trouble breathing and general signs of heart trouble. Middle of the night, woken up to a panic, my mum's first instinct was to drive him to the hospital about 20 minutes away. On their way out of the driveway, my mum realized that the ER was going to be full of people with COVID and didn't know where to take him. She went back into the driveway and called for an ambulance. About 5 minutes later, thank goodness they were close, the paramedics showed up right as my dad collapsed. They were able to revive him and sustain him until they could get him to where he needed to go. If my mum had stuck to her plan of driving 20 minutes to the hospital, he would have died in the car on the freeway. I know COVID has screwed a lot of things up for a lot of people, but for me it's been a blessing in disguise. Say hello to your 13-year-old son. I have never had a DNA test done so fast in my life. I went on a date with someone, a friend of a friend who'd only been in town about a month. I was fresh out of a painful relationship and honestly keen enough to ignore a couple of warning signs. The date rolled around, we were to meet in a pub. I'll spare you the long version of this. She arrived 3 hours late after giving the constant, "I'm just around the corner" updates. Despite this, we got on amazingly and had a lovely evening, which should have been an afternoon, but We stepped outside to make out and smoke, and she developed a case of being drunkenly sad and started talking about being a victim of the unspeakable act by her ex, in detail. And then at the end, she blew my mind by saying, "God, feel how wet I am down there, all that talking about the unspeakable act," and then stuffed my hand up her skirt and into her undies. I was stunned, pulled back, and kept a little distance for the rest of the night. There was no second date. She rejected me because apparently I wasn't over my ex, whom we'd never discussed. My gut reaction to this was that I was dodging a bullet there. This reaction was proved right when she later moved 200 miles to be with a guy she had met at a Renaissance fair earlier that month, and then got into a stabbing match with him. It's unclear from the grapevine if the stabbing was performed using replica swords, but I'd like to think it was. I mean, one can only hope. You haven't really clarified the extent of the harm that was done, or if said stabbing was done at the fair after she had moved there. So many questions, but regardless, I would have been freaked out on that date too. Ooh. When I was about 10 years old, I leaned backwards into a tall bookcase shelf, which happened to have a sword collection on the highest shelf. Many of these swords had their blades exposed for show. And what would happen at that very moment? Said shelf gave way and all of the swords came and landed on me, including my head. Surprisingly, I didn't get a single cut, no concussion, and only a small bruise on the noggin. And being young, I dismissed this incident with gracious forgetfulness. The bookcase of Damocles. I once met a girl at a bar a few years ago. She was hot and she started a conversation with me. I don't really remember about what, but at the end of it, I wanted to ask her out. But being extremely shy, I couldn't. If she hadn't started to talk to me, I would have just admired and avoided her, being a big and awkward guy. Anyway, I went to the bathroom to clear my head, and when I came back, I saw my friend, who I came there with, asking her out. Which was a total jerk move because I told him I wanted to do that. And I just stood there with an awkward smile, waiting for them to leave so I could drink my anger away. A couple of days after that, a mutual friend said that that friend from the bar was robbed by a girl he had brought to his apartment. So still today I get mixed feelings when I see him. Friends and I went to the top of Bunker Hill in Boston. It's 294 steps and they are straight up. At the top I took a picture of them and backed up a little to get them and the view. After the picture I turned around and realized there was no rail and I'd almost stepped directly into the hatch leading down the stairs. My friend was giving me a ride to the bus station. We get pulled over by the cops, and I have several ounces of green herb in my backpack. My friend has about $20 worth of green herb in his undies, which I'd given him as payment for the ride. The cops give some pretty crappy excuses like failing to signal within 50 feet of an intersection, which was obviously a pretext. Cops ask us for permission to search the car, and my scared friend gives consent like an idiot. Cops tell us to exit the car. I grab my backpack and we both get out of it. One cop begins searching the car while the other two prepare to start searching us. My mind was racing. What could I do to get out of this? This could put me inside for a long time. Out of desperation, I asked the guy about to search me, a sergeant, if I was free to go since I was only a passenger. It was the only thing I could think of to ask. To my surprise, the sergeant hands me back my ID and says I'm free to go. I later realized that at that point they hadn't found anything illegal yet, and they didn't really have reasonable suspicion to detain either of us. I was dumbfounded. That gambit shouldn't have worked, but somehow it did. I put on my backpack and I strolled calmly to the nearest intersection round the corner, and as soon as I'm out of view, sprinted about 3 blocks to a construction site and hid inside a porta-john, where I stayed for the next 2.5 hours. My friend calls me about an hour after the stop while I was still hiding in there and says the cops found his green herb right after they let me go and gave him a $500 ticket. He says that they suspect I'm the one who provided it to him and that they're driving around at this very moment looking to pick me back up. I waited until well after dark to emerge from my hiding place and caught a taxi home. I laid low for a few weeks expecting a knock at my door any day, but fortunately I've never heard anything about it again. My ex. He got engaged right after me and proceeded to cheat on her the entire time until she broke up with him. In 1994, I was on a business trip to LA. I stopped for a pack of cigarettes before getting on the Santa Monica freeway. The North Ridge earthquake happened while I was in line and parts of the freeway collapsed. I quit smoking after that pack. I overslept for work a few years back and arrived about 20 minutes late. When I got there, a car had barreled through the fence at the edge of our parking area and was headfirst into the rear of my co-worker's car. It was a hit and run while the car was reported as stolen, so there was no driver to get insurance information from, and my co-worker's insurance ended up being billed for his own repairs. My normal parking spot was the spot between the fence and my co-worker's car. If I'd been on time, it would have been my car that got hit, and the car would have collided with the side of my car, causing damage to at least 3 panels of the vehicle and likely breaking all that side's windows. It was the happiest I've ever been to be late. I'm unclear on whether the bullet here is that you were uninsured, if the car hit the exact time you would have been stepping out of it, or if you didn't like the other guy whose car did get hit, or all 3. In any case, I can't begrudge you being thankful that it happened to someone else. I moved a dresser into the basement at my mum's house before I moved out. I lost my grip and fell down almost an entire flight of stairs against a solid cinder block wall, the dresser coming right behind me. Somehow, I managed to walk away unharmed. It was unlikely to kill me, but I'm still surprised I walked away without being hurt or breaking something. I was one split decision away from dying at 12. When I was 12 years old, I was going to be home alone for one evening since my mother was going to a dinner party at her friend's house. She wouldn't be home super late, midnight at the latest, but I'd have to tuck myself in and such. I was looking forward to it and feeling like a really big girl. Hell yeah! Since we lived in a kind of shared 2-story townhouse with close neighbors on each side and a nice lady living in a separate apartment upstairs. I felt super safe being home alone at night. An hour before dinner, a good friend called and asked me if I wanted to come to her house and have dinner. Afterwards, they were going to watch The Abyss in their giant home theater. Being a lover of sci-fi and having heard about the really cool computer graphics in that movie, I'd been wanting to watch it forever. Having the chance to watch it on such a cool setup convinced me to go, despite having looked forward to being home alone. The evening went fine and I had a good time, but since the movie was really long, I got home pretty late. When I pulled up to my house on my bike, I only just noticed an orange glare in the windows upstairs before the first-story window exploded out into the garden. The fire department arrived only a few minutes later and put out the fire before it could engulf our part of the house as well. Apparently, the lady upstairs had fallen asleep on her couch with a cigarette in her hand. The fire had smoldered on the couch, developed a very toxic smoke, which not only caused the lady to get normal smoke inhalation, the chemicals also messed up her brain permanently. She was in a coma for a year or so before they ended up pulling the plug. The doozy was that we shared our ventilation system with the upstairs apartment, so our apartment was jet black. So much of the poisonous smoke had come into our home. The fire marshal said that with that amount of smoke, combined with my small stature, I would never have even noticed the fire as I would have been asleep by then, but simply have slipped into a coma and died before anyone had even noticed the fire from outside the house. I think the shock almost killed my mother as well. See, she thought I was home, I hadn't told her of my sudden change of plans, and got the call about the fire from a neighbor, to only later learn that I was shocked but safe and sound, being looked after by another neighbor. So I guess that's the story of how my budding love of sci-fi and computer graphics helped me to dodge a bullet with the big fat death stamped on it. I still love that movie. In short, being a sci-fi loving, computer interested, spontaneous preteen girl caused me to avoid dying in a house fire. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out Easy Mode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.